A Swedish Kataeb and the Left's Paradox. Swedish nationalists can often have a certain valuable exchange by discussing politics and history with Christian Lebanese. Firstly, the Christian Maronites can warn us about the consequences of a rapidly growing minority, the consequences of becoming a minority in their own country due to demographic shifts and baby factories, and the consequences of putting too much energy on infighting amongst themselves instead of paying attention to this outside threat. Also, it is among the Christian in Lebanon as the Spanish Falangism came to live as a strong and vibrant political movement. I of course refer to the Phalangists, the Kataeb. It can of course be argued that the Swedish left also could benefit by listening to them, but the problem is that the leftists in 9 times out of 10 shut down the ability to listen and think when the leftist hears the word nation.
The other 85% is a slow process which we call either ideological subversion or active measures, активные мероприятия in the language of the KGB, or psychological warfare. What it basically means is to change the perception of reality of every American to such an extent that despite of the abundance of information, no one is able to come to sensible conclusions in the interests of defending themselves, their families, their community, and their country. It's a great brainwashing process which goes very slow, and it's divided in 4 basic stages. The first one being demoralization. It takes from 15 to 20 years to demoralize a nation. Why that many years? Because this is the minimum number of years which requires to educate 1 generation of students in the country of your enemy, exposed to the ideology of the enemy. In other words, Marxism-Leninism ideology is being pumped into the soft heads of at least 3 generations of American students without being challenged or counterbalanced by the basic values of Americanism, American patriotism. The result you can see. Most of the people who graduated in the 60s, dropouts or half-baked intellectuals, are now occupying the positions of power in the government, civil service, business, mass media, educational system. You are stuck with them. You cannot get rid of them. They are contaminated. They are programmed to think and react to certain stimuli in a certain pattern. You cannot change their mind, even if you expose them to authentic information, even if you prove that white is white and black is black, you still cannot change the basic perception and the logic of behavior. In other words, these people, the process of demoralization is complete and irreversible. To get rid society of these people, you need another 20 or 15 years to educate a new generation of patriotically minded and common sense people.
The Swedish left lacks either the will to life and preservation or engage in imaginative identification with the various liberation movements in the Third World. That these liberation movements usually have a view of nationalism, traditions, deviant lifestyles, homosexuality, and so on, which are significantly, quote, worse, end quote, than Western nationalist parties, is something they conveniently chooses to ignore. The reason for this is that they envy them their popular support, their radicalism, and their anti-Americanism. And in a situation in which the Swedish left is without any realistic chance of winning popular support, like the PLO or Hamas, it is nevertheless a certain comfort at least to be able to fantasize and dream that one is included in some sort of alliance with these anti-Americans, who probably see the left and their deviant lifestyles as little more than useful idiots to be used to advance their ethnic and super conservative struggles, which, once succeeded, the leftist has no future role to play in their society. It becomes really interesting when the Swedish left are trying to repeat the success of these movements in Sweden, which is doomed to fail. Leaving out the nationalism, ethnocentrism, and cultural conservatism, religiosity, theism, aspects of these movements which they choose not to see, regardless of what Negri or Guattari may have to say about the quote, quantity or the request of multiplicity, end quote, it is namely the fact that they, Hamas and PLO, are fighting for nation and tradition that gives Hamas and the PLO their great popular support. And the Swedish left has effectively renounced any possibility to do the same. As for the Swedish nation, no matter how inclusive one can choose to define it, the fact is that the lefts possess purely emotional blocks from viewing it as a positive in any way. The train has left the station. They have missed the opportunity to gain a popular support from the indigenous people of Sweden, and this is important for several reasons. One being that the indigenous Swedish culture have much more liberal view, more in line with the contemporary left's culture than any Muslim or African liberation movement operating inside of Sweden. Another reason is that these movements recognize that the Swedish leftists is just that, a Swedish leftists, and that they can't be part of their particular African or Muslim in-group, but that they of course can help out to advance their African or Muslim causes as an outsider until they aren't useful anymore and they can be done away with. This is important because this means that the left's dream of a strong leftist culture won't be particularly long-lived without the indigenous people, whose popular support they've ensured they'll never be able to receive by their outright contempt for the Swede and his culture.
Only to become second-class citizens, not listed in the system, not existing in a sense. Illegal immigrants, the word left a bitter scent. This place is cold and evil. I should've never went to Europa, my so-called utopia, where I can't find no culture. Feel the walls getting closer and closer and closer. Right here in Europa, where I can't find no culture. Feel the walls getting closer and closer and closer, getting closer and closer and closer. Right here in Europa, nothing but claustrophobia. Right here in Europa, nothing but xenophobia. Right here in Europa, nothing but claustrophobia. Right here in Europa. Think that every race is A-okay. We all have something to be proud of. Except white people. I like every country the same, even the ones where my own music's not allowed in, or the ones that wanna bomb us.
And regarding the smaller and newer nations in the multicultural Sweden, there is a direct contradiction of the Weltanschauung and worldview between the Swedish revolutionary left and the Syriac tradition. This was clearly shown when the two, about a decade ago, clashed on the Ecce Homo exhibition. Unfortunate for the Swedish left, the similarities between a Swedish nationalist and an Arabic nationalist are considerably greater than between the latter and a queer theorist or ethnomasochist. The left's paradox. There is, in other words, an apparent paradox regarding the Swedish left. On the one hand, one strives to identify with the militant mass movements like the Black Panther Party, the IRA, and Hamas. On the other hand, one has apparently not understood much of their nature or the system they are opposing. They can, for example, not distinguish between the global system and the Western culture. Instead, they view Western culture and Western identity as identical with global capitalism. Of course, their lack of distinction, combined with their socialist desires, per automatique, leads to ethnomasochism and a celebration of each people's right to liberty and fight against globalization and Coca-Cola-niliization, except the peoples of Europe. It's interesting how many non-European leftist movements can be quite openly and aggressively racist, such as La Raza, without the left branding them. Yet European cultural conservatives and other more moderate groups are branded linguistically incorrect, racist by leftists. Historically, socialism has been quite nationalistic even in the case of Europeans. When the socialist leaders wanted to rile up the public, they usually did this with propaganda posters showing a sort of ethnocentrism, appealing to the virtues of the people, the noble traits of the people, etc. And no one was fighting for a multi-ethnic nation after the possible war or the possible political battle. They were fighting for a nation, a culture. So where does this fascination with racism come from? An explanation, as explained by Jim Goad in the Redneck Manifesto, it's a smokescreen laid out by corporate elites to distract the leftists from the real problems that face them and keep them preoccupied with a false enemy. Their anti-European racism is a distraction they've bought hook, line, and sinker. That modernism on several points is foreign for the European cultures is something they do not manage to realize. Therefore, they fail to succeed in bridging the alliance between freedom-hungry nations and peoples, which is the only alternative to modernism's obliteration of all identities except the consumers. And that is why it is such horrible right-wing extremists as Jörg Haider and Horst Mahler, to which non-European identity movements are seeking contact with, as they in instinctive levels suspect that most of their supporters on the left is driven by deeply disturbed and unrealistic doctrines and not genuine care, unlike the radical right. So in short, people who do not love their own people and their own ancestors and the ways cannot be trusted. A sound anti-colonialist movement would come back to retie or reconnect with their own heritage, and the left's anti-colonialism normally spend more time and energy to counter the Swedish counterparts to the IRA and Fatah than on something constructive.